Daniel Shadmy is joining us right now. Good morning, sir. Delighted to have you with us.
Good morning.
So let me get to the point, right? I mean, an arrest warrant for Sinwar, then Haniyeh, as well as Gallant, and of course Netanyahu. So what are the Israeli reactions? We've heard, of course, that Benjamin Netanyahu is outraged, but what about people on the street?
It did come as a surprise, I must say, and I think it's very much of an outrageous equivalence to put the leaders of a terrorist organization next to leaders of a democratic state. So regardless of how rightly you mentioned that both Gallant and Netanyahu are strongly opposed to this allegations, but also people in Israel. The court has put together on the same balance leaders of a terrorist organization that have oppressed their own people, and on October 7 launched an attack that killed 1,200 civilians and kidnapped over 240 people. On the same balance, I think this is outrageous.
Daniel, good to see you again. Welcome back. Now, just to be clear here, the charges or the recommendations for charges to be brought against the Prime Minister are based on war crimes. Which war crimes specifically do they relate to?
If I'm not mistaken, the allegations, as you rightly said, are regarding starvation and killings of civilians. So, in that aspect, I think it is kind of not in a right way to put that away in light of the amount of humanitarian aid that has been flowing into the Gaza Strip all throughout the war. And the most recent numbers are 402 trucks of humanitarian aid flowing from Israel inside the Gaza Strip yesterday. The same day that the ICC has said that Israel is responsible for starvation done by its leaders. On another hand, I think the casualty of civilian to combatant is the lowest of all wars that have been in the region, and even World War II, where the casualty of civilian per combatant was above 4-1, if I'm not mistaken, and the war in Iraq was also. So far, that ratio in the Gaza Strip was 1 to 1.5, which means that there's less civilians killed per combatant.
Right, I guess there's a question, of course, how one defines a combatant, right, and so on. But I mean, this is not what I wanted to ask you about. ICJ, right? I mean, South Africa brought the case against Israel in front of the ICJ, which has made recommendations already in January. Here, of course, mentioning that there is a danger of famine, right, happening in Gaza. So, is that related to the charges now brought on by the ICC? How you sort of, I know that these are the two independent organizations, but perhaps the narrative or the evidence, if you can unpack this to make this clearer for our viewers, that would be great.
So in that aspect, I'll put it differently in the context. Both the charges brought by the ICJ and the ICC are not in a consensus way, even in the West. So with that even particular aspect where many Western countries, Europeans, but also the United States, have not supported these claims in the ICC and the ICJ. So with that mere specific kind of detail, it just shows how it's somewhat biased by the ICJ and the ICC to lead such probes against Israel in light of this war. There are many situations, other situations where civilians are being killed in terrible wars, and all must be condemned. But the ICJ and the ICC are not focused on that. So in that aspect, both claims are in another arena of the bias against Israel in international organizations. Some of them are not recognized by leading countries in the West. They are definitely linked by several powers that are trying to link the two. and put Israel on the spot. So in that aspect, also the ICJ, there was also another case brought by Nicaragua, if I'm not mistaken, calling on Germany and condemning Germany, that was also completely discharged and not followed through. So in that case, this is a whole legal arena where Israel is being put on the spot.
Yes, I mean, Daniel, you touched on this earlier, but the United Nations halved its estimate of women and children killed. The original numbers were based on numbers given by the Hamas-based, Hamas-run authorities in Gaza, which, as you say, makes the civilian death ratio 1-to-1. If half are women and children, then the other half must be men. How many of those are terrorists, Hamas operatives? We don't know. But it does make a difference. Now, bearing that revelation in mind, surely that completely undermines these charges that are recommended against Netanyahu.
I'll take it even further. Just the mere fact that UN bodies and also international courts such as the ICC and the ICJ base their numbers on the Hamas authorities that are, again, a terrorist organization that are oppressing their own people, using them as human shields, and have launched the largest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust, is already something that we need to reconsider as a base for such claims and allegations against leaders of a democratic country. I'll say that, and I'll add that every civilian death is a tragedy, but in a war, it's a bit complicated, such in a dense area where Hamas operatives are inside schools, hospitals, use also UN infrastructures and establishments to launch their attacks from there. And again, as you rightly said, the UN had to halve their estimates because they said, and their spokesperson, an official UN spokesperson, has said himself that they cannot trust the numbers coming from Hamas. But when it comes to humanitarian aid flowing into the Gaza Strip from Israel, they do say that these numbers are credible and real, as they can be seen flowing inside the Gaza Strip, and then going into UN logistical compounds to then be redistributed. So when the ICC launches a probe against Israel's leaders, basing that on numbers of a terrorist organization, it is very complicated to then follow through on a legal basis.
Right. I mean, I just wanted to bring our attention to the fact that we're loosely using various terms, both pertaining to ICC and ICJ. And from what I gathered, for instance, the recommendations made by ICJ are legally binding. I'm not a legal expert, right? So I suggest perhaps we table this for later. But I wanted to ask you about people, right? I mean, because it is probably easier for you to just see around you. Some are, of course, not fond of Netanyahu because of the prolonged situation, war in Gaza. So what is the Prime Minister's standing within the country at the moment?
The luck we have in Israel as a democratic country in the Middle East is that we have elections and we are allowed to protest and express our discontent with our current government or prime minister if we feel that way. So there are disagreements, even within the government, even within certain factions of the coalition, as I said. And the war has come to a point where the decisions needs to be made. Now, there are some people who are more frustrated with the fact that there's no deal on the table to release the hostages, for instance. But we mustn't forget that we are dealing on the other side with a terrorist organization that have no will to do so, no will to liberate any hostages, and they have no pressure to do so either from the international community. The discontent within Israel regarding its government has not much to do.
I'm not sure if I would agree with your statement that there's no pressure to release hostages from the international community. Of course, there's pressure. I mean, I'm sorry, sir. I just, with all due respect,
No.
of course.
Well, to my opinion, I think there is not enough because if there are still over 120 civilian hostages being held by a terrorist organization and a strong call for Israel to withhold arms and stop their right to defend itself after the biggest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, I believe there would have been another result if there was a stronger pressure on Hamas to release these hostages.
Right. Well, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. Daniel, thank you very much again for joining us today.
Pleasure.